Life is complicated. This is a story of love and fear, of power and loss. We've had the Sunday school story already, I guess, the story of David slaying the giant Goliath. We've not read it this morning, but we know the story well. But we pick the story up in the complicated aftermath of the Sunday school tale. We start our story at the end of chapter 17 of 1 Samuel with David as a young man, addressed as such by Saul, called young man. Who loves that? Stood in the presence of the king with the head of Goliath. And it seems like such a straightforward tale until you recognize the fear and the jealousy that this ignites within King Saul. He sees his kingdom slipping away as this new pretender, this new kid on the block, starts to gain popularity and success. We read a key verse in this passage, in verse 12 of chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, that Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. This is the story we began a couple of weeks ago as we were looking at how Samuel anoints David as the least of Jesse's sons to be the next king. There is still a king in place. Saul is still king over Israel and Judah. Saul is still the first king of this united nation. But the blessing has passed from him. God's presence is with him no more. It may be that he is still king in name, but the glory is elsewhere. And Saul therefore fears David because he fears the loss of power that David represents. He is fearful of this young man whilst he is no longer young. Why was it that Saul, King Saul, one of the greatest warriors of the nation, why had he not gone up to fight the giant? Was he feeling his gammy knee? Was he worried about his dodgy back? Was age catching up with him? He sees this young man, this beautiful young man, this man who was described previously as having good hair and beautiful eyes. He fears his youth. He fears his success, and he fears his popularity. Oh, do you get that sense of jealousy that is ignited with the songs of the women in the villages as they go past? As they sing of Saul who has slain his thousands and of David who has slain his tens of thousands. Saul is angry. Saul is fearful. Saul's jealousy festers as his violence flares. We have this vignette of Saul in an absolute irrational rage within the palace, and he hears David playing his lyre, this lyre that used to soothe him so. And now he is not soothed, he is enraged. And Saul takes his spear and Saul tries to pin David to the wall. And even that he can't do anymore. David eludes him twice. David is sent off at the head of the army. Perhaps Saul hopes that he will die in battle. If so, there is a desperate irony there, because that is exactly what David will do to his rival in love many years later. But David does not die in battle. He succeeds because God is with him. And so the fear and the jealousy and the violence festers within Saul. This is Saul's story. And it seems obvious, and it almost seems predetermined. How else could Saul have responded? Once he saw the writing upon the wall, once he saw this young man who was going to one day take his throne, how else should Saul have responded? Surely our readings of monarchies and powerhouses through the years, we're used to this idea that what happens when a young pretender arises is that the old incumbent seeks to do away with them. Surely that's the only way this story could go. But then we have Jonathan and his story and his response. Remember, this is Jonathan, Saul's son. Jonathan, who stands to lose just as much as his father Saul. Jonathan, who in the natural order of things might have expected to be the next king. Jonathan, whose power and influence is exactly determined by his father's power and influence. Jonathan, who will lose everything if his father loses everything. Surely he too should be consumed with jealousy, fear, and rage. But that's not how the story goes. In chapter 18, we have this lavish passage of outlining the depth of love that Jonathan has for David. It is a love that it's described as being a love as if he were loving his own soul. This is a love that is deep, a love that is true, a love based on a covenant between the two of them, a love that is symbolized by Jonathan taking off all those symbols of his power and status and position and giving them to David. He takes off his robe, he takes off his armor, he gives David his belt and his sword and his bow. He gives David every symbol of his position and prestige and status, because he loves David. Jonathan had just as much opportunity to respond with fear, to respond with jealousy, to respond to potential loss with violence. But he chooses instead to love. I think the contrast between Saul and Jonathan is deliberately set up in this passage. We are supposed to notice the difference between the two. Life is complicated. But how we respond to the complications of life is still within our hands, our gift. We can respond to the things that happen around us with fear, with jealousy, with rage. Or we can choose to respond with love, with reconciliation. We can choose to respond with trust in the things that we face, in our relationships, both personal and more widely? Will we choose love as our first and greatest response? Or will we allow ourselves to descend into the madness of fear, jealousy, and rage? This story sits within the context of a faith community that knows that thousands of years later there will come a new king. Jesus will come to a world that does not understand him. Jesus will come to people who fear that they are going to lose power and prestige and status because of his message. Jesus comes and faces violence and oppression, injustice. And his response is not fear. His response is not jealousy. His response is not violence. His non-violent response to all of this is love. Love for his enemies, love for his oppressors, love for his friends, love for his disciples, love for his followers, love for his family, love for all. I think there is a contrast that still stands before us. Will we dare to take the way of Christ, which was the way of Jonathan? Will we dare to take the way of love in our relationships? Life is complicated. I know that. And I know that there will be situations we face that are far from ideal. I know that there will be things that break our hearts. But will we seek love where we can, how we can? Will we seek to respond? It's not simply that we should do it, but I think Saul and Jonathan also demonstrate that it's not just about should, it's for our own good too. Saul does not end well in this story. Will we have the courage to love? Fear or love? The choice is ours, but thankfully, the strength of God's Spirit is within us to help us in the choosing. Amen.